start. Uh, Anyone who has yet to come in, well, they can just sort of come in and join us. But yeah, let's begin. So, as you can tell from the title slide, today we have sixth class overview. So as you probably know, this is the last of the promo classes. This is the last class until a couple weeks from now, until the end of August, at which point we'll start, well, the real classes. So for this last class, thought I'd do something a little bit different. We're gonna do an overview of what we've done. We're gonna connect it all together. See if we can't make sense of everything. All right. So yeah, so I've heard from some of you through teaching assistants that you're not quite sure what you've been learning so far. You've learned like philosopher after philosopher after philosopher, but you don't really get the big picture of things. You don't get how it all links together, and you don't get quite how you've been learning philosophy, right? So philosophy is a huge subject. We've been shedding lights on different fundamental parts of it. So I want to reveal what the whole picture looks like. So as you can see, if philosophy is a cave, we didn't cover Plato's allegory of the cave, but that is a philosophical term. But if philosophy is a cave, you know, we've got a torch, we've been illuminating tiny parts of it, but meanwhile there's a whole lot of the cave yet to be explored. Still, from the parts we've illuminated, we can piece together some sort of picture. So let's talk about that picture. So there's no like one way to teach philosophy, right? And there's no one way to describe philosophy. And like what I've been doing is pretty much working off of, in a lot of ways, what Russell structured as philosophy, which is in turn like very much a English and then American tradition. So specifically, I've divided philosophy up into three categories: how to think, how to live, and how things should work. So how to think is what it sounds like: best way of thinking, best way of, you know, determining what's true, what's not true, of acquiring knowledge, right? So we've got Socrates, Thomas Aquinas, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes down so far, and that's 4 of 9. So you've got little less than half of everyone who I'd cover in the actual course in terms of how to think. In terms of how to live, we've only got 1 so far, and how to live is exactly what it sounds like: what you should be doing in your day-to-day life, what philosophers have thought of in their day-to-day life. And so we've only covered Peter Singer, who is one of the 5 philosophers we'll cover in the actual course. And finally, there's how things should work. So politics and government and the best way to lead and the best way to organize. And we've also only covered 1 out of 5 so far. We've covered only Machiavelli. So these are the 3 categories. This is what you've learned so far. So what I'm going to do over the next, let's say, hour or so, is I'm going to cover each philosopher's beliefs in brief, and I'm going to say what they all tell us about the category. So what we know so far about how to think according to philosophers, what we know so far about how to live according to philosophers, and what we know so far about how things should work according to philosophers. Then hopefully by the end of this class, you'll have a good idea of what you know, what you don't know, and a picture of the broader piece of philosophy. All right, let's go for it. Jump right in with Socrates. So, what did Socrates tell us about what to think? So, he didn't tell us much because his beliefs are a bit hard to infer from what's written about him. But we don't really care about that. What we care about is his method. How did he come to his beliefs? So it's this style of argument that Plato referred to as maieudics, or midwifery. And remember, a midwife is someone who helps a baby be born. So the idea is just like a midwife helps a baby be born, Socrates' style of argument brings out what someone truly believes. It births what they believe by asking them questions and showing that their stated beliefs are in contradiction with each other. So, remember we had that dialogue where it was Socrates and his friends, and they were talking about what is the best, or the specific question was, should I teach my son how to fight? And then so Socrates says, well, should you be figuring that out by, asking your friends? And his friend says, yes. And so Socrates says, wait, let's assume that it's not best to teach your son by a popular vote. So then he's going to argue by analogy that the thesis is incorrect. He says, well, we wouldn't come to the conclusion of how best to teach your son gymnastics or fitness by a popular vote. We would consult an expert. Now, obviously, how to teach your son or whether to teach your son how to fight is, again, more important than, whether to teach your son gymnastics. So why would you not leave your son why would you not leave how to teach your son gymnastics to a popular vote, but you'd be okay with, this big issue of whether or not to teach your son to fight to a popular vote? Seems ridiculous. So he's finished step 2. He says, by analogy, your thesis is incorrect. It's not best to teach your son by a popular vote. Then he expands the thesis. So once his friends agree with him, he says, well, wait a minute, who is this expert? And his friends say, well, I guess a fighting expert. And he's like, well, no, wait a minute. We're not just saying, should we teach your son to fight or not? What we're really saying is, how is it best to teach a son? Like, how is it best to teach your son? Who knows best about how to raise a child? And then, again, he expands the thesis by analogy. So he says, well, when you're discussing whether or not to saddle a horse or when to saddle a horse, you're not really discussing the saddle, but the horse. In other words, you're not asking the very specific question about the saddle and the horse. You're really asking, what point is the horse in its development? Is it ready to be saddled? And you know what a saddle is, right? It's like the leather thing that goes on top of a horse, allows you to ride it. So Socrates has once again expanded it, and then he expands it and expands it and expands it until eventually he gets where he's going to, right? So his whole style of argument here identifies the thesis, negates it, and then uses an analogy. So this isn't going to get you any new knowledge. However, it will show you that your stated beliefs are in contradiction. So you believe this thing and you believe this thing, and both can't be true at the same time. You can't believe that it's best to come to the conclusion of how to teach your son by a popular vote, but also believe that it's best to leave the teaching of your son gymnastics to an expert. You can't have both those beliefs at the same time. So that's the Socratic method. So that's all we need to know about how to think from Socrates. Okay, one down, 4.5 to go. So now we have Aristotle. So Aristotle we didn't cover directly, but we covered through Thomas Aquinas. So Aristotle is the student of Plato, who's the student of Socrates. And Aristotle attempted to gain knowledge about the outside world. And the way he did that was basically employing Socrates', I say here, ruthless system of questioning. So he's like, keeps on drilling down towards understanding the outside world. So if you say there is a cup on a table, well, if you keep asking questions, what is a cup? What is a table? How do you know the cup is on top of the table? Why doesn't the cup fall through the table? If it breaks, is it still a cup? If the table breaks, is it still a table? So you keep asking questions and questions and questions like that. And for Aristotle, what happens is he ends up with a very intensive system of classification. So he categorizes everything by their causes, which is a special word for Aristotle that doesn't mean the same thing as it does in plain English. So Aristotle categorizes things by what they're made up of, what caused them to happen, and what their purpose is. So a cup, for instance, this cup would be made up of ceramic. It was made by presumably someone in a factory, and the purpose is to hold water or some sort of liquid. So that's how Aristotle is thinking about the world. So this, on the other hand, as we've learned, although it's incredibly influential for, about 1,500 years after Aristotle dies, we ultimately decide, sort of as philosophers, or that it's not that useful. As Descartes would say, it's barren. You think you're getting knowledge about the outside world, but you're really not. But before we get to that, let's talk about someone who did quite like Aristotle, who was Thomas Aquinas, who's, really brings Aristotle into the Western mainstream by making Aristotle sort of the official philosopher of the Catholic Church. And as we've seen, it gets to the point where if you disagree with Aristotle, the Catholic Church will call you a heretic. And that's a problem that, Descartes is afraid of, for instance. The Catholic Church really embraces Aristotle. So Thomas Aquinas, this man here with, I don't know if he's supposed to be a giant or what. He's holding a church in one hand and a Bible in the other. I think that's a Bible, not positive. But so he's holding church in one hand, Bible in the other, has his tonsure, which is the official monthly haircut, and he has a halo because he's a saint. Okay, so Thomas combines Aristotle and Christianity. In Christianity, remember we said the most influential Christian philosopher up to Thomas Aquinas was St. Augustine. So Thomas Aquinas ends up with this system of classification where everything revolves around God and the soul which God puts into everything. So it's the same system of classification, just add God. So what's the ultimate cause of things? God. What's the ultimate result of things? God. What's the solution to everything that puzzles Aristotle? God. Like, how can you account for free will? Well, God makes it happen. How can you account for the mind? Oh, God makes it happen. So Thomas Aquinas, he's not particularly original. And And remember, Russell's criticism about him is that the conclusion is fixed in advance. And like, as we'll see, he's like very much, he knows God exists and everything in the Bible is true, and he knows Aristotle's correct. And Thomas Aquinas isn't so much trying to discover truth as he's trying to figure out some sort of method where both of them can be right. So let's revisit Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, combining God and Aristotle. Everything is made up of what it is and what it does. That's just pure Aristotle, right? Those are the causes, what it is and what it does. A cup is ceramic and it holds water. All right. Everything can be divided into the living and the non-living. The living is made up of that which acts, the soul, and that which is acted on, the body. So living and non-living, that's very Aristotelian. Saying that which acts is the soul, that's Christianity. That which is acted on, the body. You figure Aristotle probably would have said that which acts is something like the mind, but Aquinas instead says, well, it's the soul and it's immortal and it's part of God, da 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 da. All right. So man is given every essential degree of perfection by the soul, living, being, and thinking. So this idea of perfection is a very Christian idea. And as we learned when we went through Thomas Aquinas' Quinque Viae, the 5 ways to prove God, perfection is a very complicated word, and it does not mean what it means in plain English. It means essentially being very, like, God is perfect, and how perfect you are is how close you are to God. So, for example, being is more perfect than non-being. Why? Because God exists, so if you exist, then you're close to God. Same thing with living. So, when Thomas Aquinas is classifying things, part of the way he's classifying things is he's classifying them by how close they are to God, which Aristotle wouldn't have done. So, we see things with our eyes, but understand them with our soul/intellect. So, that's trying to reconcile Aristotle and Augustine. So we see things with our eyes, yep, for sure, very Aristotelian. Understand them with our soul, that's Augustine. And what's interesting now is you guys can see how that is sort of close to what Descartes says, right? With his idea of perception. Except Thomas Aquinas isn't quite taking it the same way as Descartes. He means it, well, he means soul or understanding things in a different way. So it's sort of like understanding things on both like a literal level, but also like a religious level. So, and finally, God is, well, finally for this page anyways, God is perfect and he is the same as what he does. So if everything is made up of what it is and what it does, who breaks that rule? God. God is the same as what he does. I would say it's not that complicated, but it is actually super complicated. And that's part of the reason why the Catholic Church embraces it and sort of argues over it for, you know, a lot of years. But it does at least make sense if you understand where Thomas Aquinas is getting everything from. So, 2 fundamental axioms of being, non-contradiction, and principle of causality. So, nothing can exist which contradicts itself. It can't be a cup and not a cup, and everything has to be caused by something, which causing is both like the obvious term that we use in English, this causes this, and also the Aristotelian term of like, what is the cause of something being what it's made up of and what the purpose is. So this permits miracles, right? anything illogical that Aristotle would have disagreed with, Thomas Aquinas just says, oh, well, it could have existed. So, and the Bible tells us that it exists, so we have to take its word. Didn't contradict itself, came from something, we're good. And then we have Aristotelian logic here, which, Thomas Aquinas takes and expands a bit, to be fair, which you can compare to Francis Bacon's Idols. So this would be Francis Bacon's Idols of the Marketplace, right? How language confuses us. So 3 ways of describing something: univocality, general descriptors, milk from cows and milk from goats. And I did take this opportunity to put really cute pictures of baby cows and baby goats. I hope you guys are okay with that. So the analogy, which compares things: this food is healthy for you, that animal is healthy. Both of those involve being not sick. And then equivocation, which is using the same word for 2 different things, which, Francis Bacon would say is the clearest example of an idol of the marketplace: hard surface and a hard test. So you would get confused if you tried to figure out why this surface is hard and this test is hard, because they don't have an obvious thing in common, and it's not fruitful logically to try to figure out what makes them the same. All right, cool. So finishing up here, so everything is caused by something else. Everything has an ultimate purpose. So caused by something else, Aristotle, ultimate purpose, that's God. So Aristotle is fine with everything having a purpose. Aquinas is like, well, let's say everything has an ultimate purpose. So God acts in everything and everyone according to their nature. So we've got a classifying of people: bad people and good people. And then we've got Augustine's view of free will, or just the sort of Catholic view of free will, which, bad people do bad things because God knows that they're bad. So, and people only really know things when what they know can be seen in the outside world. So this is against Socrates, against sort of like the logic that might disrupt Thomas Aquinas' view of the world. And it's just like, anything that he can't quite explain that doesn't fit in logically, he says, well, it happened, the Bible tells us it happened, so we know it's true. So it's complicated. Thomas Aquinas, obviously a smart guy. He's taking what is not that fruitful of philosophy in the first place, which is Aristotle's system of classification, and he's attaching God to it. And it ends up being complicated, sort of a mess. The Catholic Church today still thinks it's great, but I think when we read it, it's not the sort of clear logic that we get from other philosophers, which should itself make you somewhat suspicious. Doesn't necessarily mean if logic is unclear that it's wrong, but it should make you suspicious. But I think really at the end of it, Thomas Aquinas trying to come up with this system where you know everything through God, and God is the cause, and God is the purpose, and da-da-da-da-da. You can really see where Russell comes from, where he says the conclusion is fixed in advance. So, and this is Bertrand Russell as an old man, and I sort of thought this picture was very appropriate because he seems very disapproving. He looks like he knows that you did something wrong, you made a logical error somewhere. He's just waiting for you to figure out exactly which logical error that you made. Okay, so we've just covered about 1,000 years of philosophy. And what was that? 30 minutes. That was pretty fast. Good work. So, next up, we have Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon, he takes a different tact. He throws out everything before him. He says Aristotelian logic is awful. We need something better to give us knowledge about the outside world. So he comes up with what we would consider today the start of science. So first of all, he defends himself. Even though he is in Protestant England, he's not going to be so crazy as to say, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in anything. So he starts off by saying, well, religion and faith have their purpose to restore mankind's innocence. Science has its purpose, get the dominion of nature back. Fourth, the fall from grace, which was, mankind being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So, and science's purpose is to question nature. So faith is to believe the impossible. Everything that is possible is science's domain. So, he is against Aristotle. Science can only be found out about by observing the natural world, not from reasoning by your own mind. If you try to come up with true knowledge about the outside world based on, based on what is it made of, what is its purpose, and you're not actually looking at it and examining it, you're not really going to get any information. And he believes this should become a state enterprise and that this is sort of what everything should be run by. He's very concerned about the cycle of history from tyranny to democracy to tyranny. So he's saying, like, this is our chance to sort of save ourselves. So he has a very high opinion of science and what his method of science can do for everything. His Novum Organum, right? His new instrument. So, oh, by the way, so I found this picture of Francis Bacon as a young man. Sort of astonishing, right? He's, I hate to call a young man pretty, but it's hard to avoid the idea that this is a pretty young man. Anyways, so what is this science that Francis Bacon keeps talking about? Well, science is induction. It's eliminative induction, fact to axiom to physical law. And what is induction? Well, it's reasoning from a pattern. Why do I think that the sun will rise up tomorrow? Because it's risen up every day. Meanwhile, Aristotle and especially Socrates were big on deduction. So you have famous example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You have premises, and if the premises are true, comes down to a conclusion. And the conclusion is only true as the premises. So Bacon's not a fan. He says the premise, you need to assume a premise, and then your conclusion's going to be tainted. So science instead needs to be induction, fact, axiom, physical law. So in order to properly perform this induction, to really properly reason from patterns, we need to free our mind from the four idols which can cloud our thoughts. So idols of the tribe, which are common to our race. These are what we would call today like sort of psychological, the sort of psychological mistakes that we all make. For instance, mankind tends to reason from too few of patterns because we find it difficult to sort of reason from a lot of things at once. So for instance, you might see that something happens twice and you say, oh, it must happen every time, but really you needed to look at it more. And then we have idols of the den, which belong to an individual. And that's how an individual acts. So, Bacon said some people are optimistic and they're always looking to prove something. Some people are pessimistic, they're always looking to disprove something. We have idols in the marketplace, which come from misusing language, which is like, well, Aquinas actually had a couple examples. And finally, we have idols of the theater, which come from philosophy. And when come from philosophy, he's specifically, his big thing, although not his only one, is Aristotle. He's like, anyone who tries to think in the method of Aristotle, who tries to analyze what I'm saying in the method of Aristotle, who, even says Aristotle's name, is going to be mistaken. You have all these ideas from him, and they are awful ideas, and they are preventing you from actually knowing truth about the outside world. Well, also, before we go over Descartes, I will mention again Bacon's method, which, as I've told you, his exact method is not what we use today. His exact method, write down every case which contains the phenomenon that you're thinking of, and then try to reason from there. So, for heat, for instance, he had a pretty good idea, which was heat was caused by vibrating molecules. And then the way he figured that out, or tried to prove that, was by writing down every example of heat, from the rays of the sun to strong acid, which burns the skin, to spicy food, and then tried to figure out what made things hot. It wasn't a great method. So, but what we did get from Descartes was, from Bacon was, first of all, a defense of the importance of induction. There are logical problems with induction, and we'll come to that with a couple philosophers who really outline exactly why induction is a tricky thing to use. However, it is what we use today to get knowledge about the outside world. And he also comes up with a method to perform induction in a scientific manner, including with these idols, what we would refer to now as, for instance, double-blind studies or the scientific method. All these ways of sort of guarding against our own mental fallacies, which is important because no one else before Bacon has really considered the way in which our mind can trick us. Socrates, Aristotle, Aquinas, all of them are assuming their mind works perfectly all the time. Bacon is saying, no, doesn't matter how smart you are, your mind can trick you. You need to set up a system in which your mind can't trick you. And the last philosopher to tell us how to think was Monsieur Descartes. Before we go on, can everyone understand me? Everyone hear me, understand me, see everything? All right, great. Are there any questions before we go on? I'm glad reviewing is helpful. All right, cool. So I'm going to continue. So we've covered almost everyone who's going to teach us how to think, and now we have our last, the immortal Frenchman, Rene Descartes. Oh, by the way, I thought I might as well tell you the answer to why that's a somewhat funny joke. The one and only Descartes. So first of all, the one and only is an American expression that we just use as like complimentary way. Like for instance, they might introduce an actor like that by saying like he's unique and no one can compare to him. Like, you know, the one and only, well, if you knew the actor Robin Williams, he would always be introduced like that. The one and only Robin Williams, because he was unique and he was very funny and no one acted like him. So introducing Rene Descartes like that is funny because Descartes, you know, first of all, great philosopher, but also Descartes' philosophy starts solipsism, and solipsism is the well, solipsism is a system of philosophical belief that no one else exists. And you can see how that would come from Descartes, where he's saying, like, I think, therefore I am. I can't prove anyone else exists. So when I introduce Descartes as the one and only Descartes, it's making a joke because he's in some ways a solipsist. He can philosophically prove that he exists, but he can't prove that anyone else exists. And it's also sort of introducing him like he's a movie star or an actor or something. So that was the joke. It's probably not the world's funniest joke. I don't think I'm gonna, you know, take it on tour or make millions of dollars off of it. But I was sort of proud of it when I came up with it. Okay, but enough about that. Let's actually talk about Monsieur Descartes. So Descartes uses skepticism as a means for establishing absolute knowledge. So while Bacon deals in probability to gain knowledge about the outside world through induction, Descartes is asking about absolute knowledge. What do we know? So Descartes isn't arguing against Bacon, though. He's arguing against Aristotle, just like Bacon was. So syllogisms of Aristotle rely on sensation. Everything that Aristotle thinks that he knows is because he sees it or smells it or feels it. If Aristotle thinks there's a cup on the table, he only thinks that because he sees a cup and he sees the table. According to Descartes, there's a possibility that he's mistaken, that it's an illusion or something like that. So we need to come up with something better than that. So Descartes says, what should we do? Well, let's start with what we know what's true, and what we know is true, and what can be doubted. And what can be doubted? Well, almost everything. You can doubt your senses because it's impossible to tell whether you're dreaming or whether you're awake. Descartes says, like, you know, there are times when I'm sure I was awake, and then I wake up in my bed. And it was a dream so vivid that I can't even believe that I wasn't awake. And I think we've all had dreams like that. He says, can I doubt that 2 plus 3 equals 5, or that a square has 4 sides? Yes. You make mistakes, so you know you're mistaken sometimes, that's for sure. And maybe you're not only mistaken sometimes, but you're mistaken all the time. And he says, even if you think like, oh no, God is too good, well, Descartes says, maybe it's that some demon is making us consistently get the wrong result. He's saying, I don't actually believe this, but as a thought experiment, we could imagine there's a demon, or what Descartes calls an evil genius, who consistently messes with our thoughts. So we never think logically. So if you can doubt everything that you see, and you can doubt everything and you think, what can't be doubted? Well, only this. There is an existence of a thinking part of us. So even if everything we think, feel, and know is wrong, there must be some part of us to be wrong. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if there's an evil genius who is constantly making everything we think incorrect, in order for him to do that, we still need to be thinking in the first place. So, perception. So now that we've established that some part of us thinks, it's worth asking how we know the rest of the world. We seem to know the rest of the, we go through the world pretty well. It seems very real. So how do we do that? Especially, you know, Descartes' like, I can only prove that I think. And that's the only part I know for sure. But the thing that seems most real is the outside world. It seems strange to only be able to prove the part which seems the least real. So how does he sort of reconcile this? How does he make himself comfortable with this? Well, while you think you interpret everything directly through your senses, you really bring it first into your mind. So, if you take a piece of wax and you bring it close to a fire, it changes in look, smell, and temperature, but we still see it as the same piece of wax. So why do we see it as the same piece of wax? Well, because we've been interpreting it through our mind. We don't, we thought we were interpreting it by just seeing it, but really we were interpreting it through our mind, which allows us to keep thinking of it as the same piece of wax even after it's melted. So knowing this, Descartes says our better means of perception is not the senses, but the mind, and the part which is cut off here says which cannot be deceived. Sorry about that. So the senses can't be the senses can be deceived, the mind cannot be deceived. The senses wouldn't realize that it's the same piece of wax after it melted. The mind does realize that. So then we've got, then Descartes goes through how can we trust our senses, and he comes up with the answer, we can trust our senses because of God, and God is too good to deceive us, which, as I've said before, the arguments aren't great. He proves the existence of God with basically Thomas Aquinas' proofs. And I mean, and I think just logically and sort of innately, it feels strange to be like proving that the outside world is real based on the existence of God. Like, I think that works maybe if you are a very religious person, but if you're not, it seems not that satisfying. So let's just take Descartes' word for it. The outside world exists. So we exist as thinking beings. You know, there's two parts of us. There's the thinking part, which is a mind/soul, and there's the being part, which is the body. So the two interact. You hear a loud noise, like if you're at a rock concert, you're going to find it very hard to do a math problem because it's hard to think. Or on the other hand, your mind can move your body. You can, you know, choose to move your arm or to speak. So they're not the same because for two reasons. One is religiously, which was important to Descartes, may not be important to you. The soul ascends to heaven, is immaterial. The body is material. It doesn't ascend to heaven. It rots in the ground. And then there's also the logical side of it. Where is the mind in the body? The mind doesn't like exist anywhere. You know, they've dissected a body, they can't find it. And also, a body is made up of like physical things, right? So it must be deterministic. It must be the laws of nature applied to it. But the mind has free will. So how's that possible? How is it possible that the mind has free will, the body is deterministic, the two are interacting? So where is this point of contact? And this is this sort of problem of free will is still a problem today. Descartes tries to answer this by saying, well, the mind interacts with the body through the pineal gland, which has to do with we now know today, has to do with the production of melatonin, which helps regulate your sleep cycle. Not a great answer on Descartes' part. Excellent question, not a great answer. And then we also have Descartes' physics. And I mentioned this only so we get a final idea of how like Descartes thinks about the world. His physics, his science are mechanical. So it's geometrical understanding of physical bodies. Everything is triangles, circles, squares. And then you come up with things you come up with how objects move, how everything works through laws of motion. His laws of motion are pretty good. They're not as good as Newton's. They're pretty good. Unfortunately, unlike someone like Bacon, who presumably prove it through observation, Descartes proves his laws of motion through references to God and how God wants the laws of motion to be this because they're more perfect than that. Not important. They're pretty good laws of motion. The explanation of them is very bad. The way he explains things mechanically, though, for instance, is all matter is composed of tiny parts. So you can understand gravity by like diffusion of tiny parts. Heavy objects sink through the parts until they hit the ground. And this is actually an example of Descartes' vortices, is what they're called, like swirling things of tiny parts, which is what we think of as gravity. So we've got two methods of thinking from Descartes here. As Russell puts it, like Descartes, because he contradicts himself, actually ends up being a far more interesting philosopher and has so much more to offer than he would if he didn't contradict himself, than if he stayed logically consistent, because we've got the first way of thinking, which is this radical skepticism, like we only reason like based on what we can absolutely know as truth based on deduction. And then we've also got this other way of thinking where we have these first principles, these laws of motion, and these he doesn't do a great job of defending why he thinks they're true, but then through their interactions, he tries to prove other things, or he tries to explain other things. So that's actually, in a broad sense, is sort of how we do physics today, right? We have these laws of motion, and then we apply them to moving objects. You don't come up with new laws of motion every time you need to model like a cannonball soaring through the air. You use the laws of motion that exist. So let's talk about our general overview here of how to think. So we've got basically four ways of thinking. We've got Socrates drawing out contradictions in people's thinking. So if they have two stated thoughts which are in contradiction, he'll show them that they're in contradiction. Aristotle tries to use that same system of questioning to understand the outside world, and he ends up just categorizing everything, but doesn't really understand it with this Barham system of philosophy. Aquinas takes this, combines it with Christianity, and it gets really complicated and even less useful. Bacon retreats from this, and he decides to use reasoning from observation and induction to understand the outside world, beginning the scientific method. And then Descartes retreats from this way of thinking in a different way and has these two simultaneous modes of thinking. One is nothing can be known about the world at all, and the other one is the world can be known mathematically through the mechanics, through the first principles of how the world works, through the rules of how the world works. So, where are we right now? 6 philosophers down. What can we say about how to think? So, we can say we have 3 ways of thinking philosophically right now. We have Bacon's reasoned induction, we have Descartes' inner deduction, and we have Descartes' mechanical reasoning from first principles. So Bacon reasons from observations. Descartes, his first method is to reason from things that are absolutely true, and this is just him thinking inside his own head. And then his other way is I have a bunch of rules, and then I come up with observations about the world by seeing how the rules interact with each other. And what has happened to our other people? Well, Descartes has sort of, you can see his direct lineage from Socrates. You know, Socrates has these careful reasoning, you know, this is in contradiction with this. So Descartes takes that, totally accepts it. Aristotle and Aquinas, on the other hand, with their categorizations, have been left by the wayside. And that's this picture here. You can imagine this as Aristotle left in the dust as science has continued on into the distance. So he was useful, he was popular for like 1500 years, and now he's done. So that's how to think. So next up, how to live. And we only have one here. We have Peter Singer, our 20th century philosopher and 21st century philosopher, professor at Princeton University, and everyone's favorite controversy artist. He makes people get very mad. So he's fundamentally a utilitarian. He believes ethics should be about measuring than maximizing happiness. So how do we measure happiness and then we maximize it? We try to make the most amount of happiness in the world. Specifically, he's a preferential utilitarian, so he thinks happiness comes when people's preferences are fulfilled, so he tries to get that the most amount of preferences fulfilled in the world. So here are Peter Singer's beliefs. All ethics need to be taken from the point of view of an omniscient spectator trying to maximize global happiness. Okay, global happiness is maximized when the preferences of all involved are fulfilled. Sure, fine. All animals should be considered equally. Okay. All sentient animals should be considered equally, including humans. This gets a little stranger. We go from humans to all sentient animals. But, you know, this is him continuing on his way. And these are his 4 sort of core thoughts. And now, if we keep going, it is wrong to kill anyone or anything with those rights because that would decrease global happiness. You have to assume that like no one has a preference to die. It is acceptable to kill anyone without those rights because it would, if it would increase global happiness. So if you think that someone's too young to have a preference, for example, a newborn baby, okay to kill them. This is what Peter Singer thinks. It's wrong not to help anyone in need, even if they have no connection to you, because we have to think about global happiness. And if we're thinking globally, then it doesn't matter where someone is. And finally, being moral is rational. So not only can he defend this in terms of ethics, but he can defend it in terms of logic. So this is Peter Singer's very brief way of living. Is essentially, if we go to the most broad utilitarian standpoint, he's saying think about how you would maximize global happiness and then do that. His specifics are what gets crazy and what gets him controversial. So, what can Peter Singer tell us about how to live? So, in retrospect, I regret introducing Peter Singer so early. So I thought he'd be thought-provoking, and I think he was, but I don't think I thought enough about how it would be confusing for you guys trying to form an overall picture of philosophy if we're gonna, because we're introducing someone who's, very, very recent, and we didn't go over the foundations. I mean, for one thing, I certainly should have covered the beginnings of a utilitarian mindset with people like John Stuart Mill, and even earlier that with Kant's categorical imperative. So when it comes time for the actual classes, we'll actually build up from the ground up a system of how to live, and hopefully it won't be quite so confusing. So anyhow, even though this is confusing, you can still see a few things going on here. Peter Singer starts from a few first principles stated but not defended, like Descartes' mechanics. So he starts off with these 4 things, right? Maximize global happiness with preferences, consider all humans equally, consider all sentient animals equally. So he starts off with these few first principles, which aren't really that defended, and then he just goes deductively through his conclusions without regard for relation to the real world. He uses real world examples, but he's not trying to express truths about the real world. He actually even says, like, maybe this isn't something that's possible in the real world, but that's not my concern. My concern is what you should be doing. So, in short, he's a great example of using the thinking methods of someone like Descartes to a moral question of how one should live. So I think he's good in that sense. But again, I do apologize that I introduced such a modern philosopher so early in the class. I should have built it up, and I wasn't thinking. So, but that is how to live in a nutshell. So, last up on the philosophies we covered, we have Niccolo Machiavelli, as the Italians say it. Let's see, it is, I know it's 10:03. I'm going to finish up this, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll go on to something else. So, I know you guys are probably a little antsy for your break, but stick with me as we go through everyone's favorite Italian. So remember, Machiavelli is dealing with things through sort of 2 famous works, happen after he gets kicked out of politics. We've got The Prince and Discourses on Livy. The Prince is princedoms, how to hold it, how to get one, how you should act. Discourses on Livy are republics, why republics are great. And it's like the sort of thing that for many, many years people have tried to reconcile the two. But let's go over The Prince first. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. That's the overarching idea of the Prince. This isn't about what ought to be done. This isn't a moral question. This is what you should be doing if you want to live. If you are okay with someone killing you, you can do something else. But if you are not okay with this, you should follow what Machiavelli says. So the Prince, it has to do primarily with princes who have just acquired their territory, because Machiavelli says it is easy to be a hereditary prince. If someone gives you your territory, like if your dad ruled before you, you have to mess up really badly to lose that. So he doesn't really care about that. So a strong princedom is one which can defend itself. A weak princedom depends on allies. So he says, if you want what should be done, or what you should do if you want to keep your kingdom, is your first priority is be able to defend yourself. You need a strong army and sound laws. You need to be stable and able to resist outsiders. If you are relying on mercenaries or relying on allies, you are going to have a very bad time. So, what are the qualities of a prince? Well, so a prince should focus on perfecting the art of war. This is unsurprising for a man who was just saying you need a strong army. And he has this great quote here: being disarmed makes you despised. This isn't, there's no room here for nonviolence. If you are disarmed, you are despised. If you have no weapons, people will hate you. And perfecting the art of war is both physical, hunting, and mental, studying military history. And he says the prince should be virtuous, but not all the time. If you need to, you should be able to do whatever is necessary. Just remember, don't get a reputation of being evil. It's better to have a reputation of being good and sometimes doing evil than to have a reputation of being evil and, well, doing evil or doing good. So your reputation is important. What you do, is a separate business. You should not be generous, though. Generosity requires high taxes, and people get used to a prince being generous. Once you discontinue generosity, everyone complains. They start to think that you owe them something. So don't give out your money. However, if you have other people's money to give out, you should give out other people's money. It's better to be feared than loved, because men worry less about doing an injury to one who makes himself loved than to one who makes himself feared, which is pretty close to being disarmed makes you despised. So it's the best way to be is to have people be afraid of you, be afraid of what you can do. And alongside all of this, especially the not be generous and not should appear to be virtuous, prince should always appear to keep his word, but not be afraid to break it. So your reputation is important, but don't let your reputation affect what you're actually doing. Don't be afraid to lie if that's what you need to, as long as you don't get the reputation of being a liar. So that's the prince. Very, very quickly. So let's cover discourses on living. So now that we've talked about how if you're a prince, you should be a nasty person with a huge sword who lies all the time, what can we say about discourses on Livy? Well, we can say that Machiavelli says republics are actually better. So Machiavelli writes this book because he sees all the chaos around him. He's living in Italy in a time where it's a bunch of tiny countries that are constantly fighting and invading each other. And Machiavelli says, what happened to Rome? Rome was politically great. Right now, we are politically awful. So let's study the past. And he's basing this off of Roman historian Livy in his book Ab Urbe Condita, which was a history of Rome. So discourses on Livy is primarily concerned with the structure, nature, and evolution of republics. Machiavelli says republic is the best aim for a state. Liberty is what a state should strive for, and liberty can only fully be achieved in republics. For instance, Machiavelli is living at a time when France is becoming an absolute monarchy. So the king is gaining a lot of power. But, funnily enough, Machiavelli says France is an example of a perfect monarchy because you have checks and balances. It says Parliament checks the power of the kings and nobles, which means the state is peaceful and secure. It's funny, Machiavelli apparently didn't see France's turn towards absolute monarchy coming, because at this point he's a big fan of the fact that France is, has checks and balances in their monarchy. So he's saying they're as good as it gets, but it can never be free. It can never be free because security for a monarchy means you have to disarm the people to prevent uprisings. But if people are disarmed, they're passive and impotent and therefore not free. So France is so worried about the people coming up, overthrowing the nobles, overthrowing the king, that they've taken away the people's ability to defend themselves, which means if they can't defend themselves, they're not free. So why is that important? Why should you care? Well, freedom or liberty is the way to ensure the power of a state. Free discourse is vital to determining the wisest course of action and the best leader. And the reason that is even if you have a leader who's not a bad guy, it's easier to convince him of doing something unwise than it is everyone of doing something unwise. In the same way, it's easier to convince a prince to appoint someone corrupt than it is to convince the people to appoint someone corrupt. And even better, there's flexibility with freedom of discourse. If you have, if you're a time of war, you can appoint a leader who's warlike. If it's a time of peace, you appoint a leader who's peaceful. So if it's all that great, why do republics fall? Well, they fall when their institutions fail to change with the times. So here I've put up the slogan for the French Revolution: Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Liberty, equality, brotherhood. And by the way, this is still like a powerful slogan in France. If you say it, like, it occasionally comes up in French politics, and it's always a big deal because, the last time this was a big slogan, many heads got chopped off. So it's still a big deal. So this is them overthrowing the monarchy, and I think to some extent they'd agree with what Machiavelli says here, that they needed their freedom of discourse. So whether or not it's whether or not Machiavelli is right here, I'm not sure. I live in a country in which it does seem like Donald Trump may become president. So whether or not it is hard or easy to convince many people to elect a leader who is not great seems to me a question to be determined. But that is besides the point for a philosophy class. So how do we reconcile the prince and discourses? Well, so many philosophers have found it difficult that the same guy is writing both. Princes should be ruthless and dishonest, and republics are great because of liberty. And solutions have been proposed. Prince's satire, Prince's just supposed to flatter the Medici. Machiavelli didn't mean it. Machiavelli changed his mind after he wrote The Prince. For me, however, I think the works are intended for different purposes. Machiavelli never repudiated The Prince. He never said he didn't believe it anymore. And I think it's because one is about the skill and then the other is about the virtue. One is about developing the ability to rule, and the other one is developing the virtue that makes you sort of, makes ruling ideal. And, he emphasizes like this is the best for the whole state, not just the ruler. Okay, so what can we say about how things should work? And our last philosopher here. So he's not the first person to think about how things should work. but he starts the field as it exists today, namely as political science. And notice the science part of that, with this idea of I am going to try to come up with real observations about how things should work based on facts in the outside world. So unlike Peter Singer, who's developing his morality and doesn't care about the outside world, Machiavelli is only correct insofar as he is correct about the outside world. What can we say about Machiavelli the guy? He has an excellent classical education, but he's not a philosopher, so his thinking is sloppier than a philosopher's. He sort of states things without proving them. He's not particularly careful with how he states things. However, if you want a way of evaluating Machiavelli, I'd advise you to evaluate him in terms of Francis Bacon, which is gather all your facts, put them together, come up with general observations from them. Is what you're saying true? Is what you're saying false? Does it correspond to the outside world? And in case you're wondering about this portrait of Machiavelli, it is not a portrait, it is a model from the video game Assassin's Creed 2, which, as I've mentioned before, I quite like, even though it has not great historical accuracy. So, in conclusion, for this section of the lesson, what can we say about the big picture of philosophy that we've learned so far in these 6 classes? Okay, let's start with how to think. At this point, we have good understanding of the ways people thought about how to think and how to gain knowledge up to the 1600s. So what's next? We need to progress past the 1600s, delve more deeply into how we sense things, how we reason things, how we use language, and how we gain true knowledge about the world. So what it means to actually look and see things, how exactly we use logic, how exactly we use language to express our thoughts, and how we perform experiments to get an idea of truth. So these philosophers that we still need to cover would be Hume, Kant, Wittgenstein, and Popper. And this will cover us from 1600s through the 20th century. So this is the part of philosophy that will be most practically useful. I think you'll use it most in your day-to-day life. If all you learn from this class is how to think based on what philosophers have been, saying for thousands of years, then anything else you want to know, you can teach yourself. And I think that's really powerful, right? It means everything else is open for you. And that's the reason why I spend the most time on how to think, because I think it's the most practically useful part of philosophy. What can we say about how to live? Well, at this point, given that we've only had one class, and it was about a modern day philosopher, we have a not very good understanding of how people thought about how to live up to the present day. So what do we still need to do? We still need to learn about how people thought about ethically living day to day in the ancient world, how they thought about living day to day in the crowded modern world, how they thought about living in the scientific world, which is, scientific world, I mean, with airplanes and bombs and guns and whatever. So the philosophers we need to cover are the Stoics in ancient Rome, Kant in the 1700s, Mill in England in the 1800s, and the existentialists, who are mostly French in the 20th century, so the 1900s. So this is the part of philosophy which should be most applicable to you in your day-to-day life, as presumably this is what you will regularly come in contact with. When you are on the subway and wondering whether or not to give your seat up to an old person who looks very tired, this is how to live. This is ethics, and we will see what various people think about it, including the Stoics, Kant, Mill, and the existentialists. Last up, how things should work. So what do we know? We know about the beginnings of political science with Machiavelli. The first attempt to really come up with a scientific way of saying, how should we rule? How should we set up things? What do we still need to learn? We need to go back one, learn about the first attempt at imagining an ideal government. We need to learn about the invention of liberalism, which is what we most of us live in today, this sort of society in which, well, people are free and they have rights. We have the application of political science to liberalism, which is how do you actually make sure that people are free and have rights? How do you make that happen in the same way that Machiavelli tries to make, well, princes keep power? And finally, we need to go over what can we say about city governance. And the application of political science to city governance, how best to organize and run a city. So these philosophers are Plato, John Locke, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, and Jane Jacobs, respectively. So ancient Greece, 1600s England, 1700s America, 20th century America. So if you are interested in politics, government, and going into government, this is important. However, if you aren't, this is just interesting. Personally, I'm not particularly interested in going into politics, so I find this stuff interesting, but maybe not so useful. Anyways, let me give you guys a chance to go on a 5-minute break. So I'll see you back here at, let's say, 10:26, and then we're going to cover a topic, a big topic, which I don't cover in my normal lecture slides, which is aesthetics. And then I also have a lovely quote for you from Bertrand Russell. So don't leave forever. Just come back at, let's say, 10:26. Sound good? Sound good. Break. All right. So we're not gonna start up again with the slides quite yet. Before we do, are there any questions about this broad 6-class overview that I can go over? I appreciate the roses. Are there any questions, though? Why did Descartes still not get rid of the influence of religion after he put forward his theories? So for one thing, there's sort of two sides to it. Descartes just claimed, I'm a religious guy, I'm a Christian. There have been accusations that Descartes was just not brave enough, because he is living at a time at which, like, he had just seen Galileo get in a ton of trouble with the Catholic Church. Descartes has no desire to get in trouble with the Catholic Church, even though he sort of does already. He does get books banned and whatever. But he definitely doesn't want, he really just doesn't want any trouble. So if he can state his philosophy and not get in trouble over it, he'll be very happy. Good question. Anyone else? No? Good. All right. Then let us begin again with our PowerPoint slides. All right. So mini lecture, aesthetics. So what is this? What is this mini lecture about? Well, it's about a section of philosophy called aesthetics. It's actually pretty big. There are a lot of people who've written on it. I don't particularly like the debates, so I haven't included them in my main slides. I find them pretty unsatisfying. I thought I'd give you guys today a brief overview of aesthetics as a philosophic discipline. I'll give you some names. If you want to explore it on your own, you're welcome to. And I will say that I'm like very much like Bertrand Russell. It's like English tradition and American tradition. Aesthetics isn't taken very seriously. The Germans, on the other hand, what are known as continental philosophers, absolutely love it. And they talk about it endlessly. So if you do read aesthetics, you'll be reading a lot of German philosophers. So the central question that they try to cover in aesthetics is, what is beautiful and why is it considered beautiful? So here I have sort of mathematically modeling, trying to figure out why a woman's beautiful, and she used mathematical modeling to put on her makeup. Okay, so let's go over the relevant philosophers. As you might expect, first person to talk about this is Aristotle. Aristotle talks about everything. And so he has this theory of beauty where he says things are beautiful if they give pleasure to the viewer without provoking desire. So for instance, if you see a flower, it makes you happy, but you don't necessarily want the flower. Meanwhile, if you see a beautiful woman or a handsome man, it can't be beautiful because it might make you happy to look at them, but at the same time, you want them to be your boyfriend or your girlfriend, so that doesn't count as beautiful, according to Aristotle. And what are the elements of beauty? As you might imagine, he categorized these as well. He categorizes everything all the time. So it's order or wholeness, so it's not broken. It's symmetry, so, symmetric, and you can see the symmetry here. And definiteness. So it has to exist and have clear boundaries. So a flower is the perfect example of something that's beautiful, gives you pleasure, you don't want to take it, it's whole, it's symmetric, and here we have a radial symmetry, right, like a circle, and it's definite. It has definite edges and exists. So, next person, big person to talk about it is Thomas Aquinas, who says, I think the same thing that Aristotle does, but also God. It's what Aquinas does with everything. So, using his own terms, beauty has actuality, proportion, radiance, and integrity. So, actuality, it exists. Proportion, it's well balanced, or what Aristotle would call symmetric. Radiance, it seizes your attention. So what Aristotle would say, it gives you pleasure. Wholeness, it's not lacking in anything. So for Aquinas, what is beautiful? Well, the Trinity is beautiful. The Trinity is beautiful because it exists. You have, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. It's well balanced. You have the three of them. Radiance seizes your attention. I think that was sort of obvious from Thomas Aquinas' viewpoint, like, how can you not be seized attention? Wholeness, it's not lacking in anything. So that makes sense. And he even says, like, actually, you can say the Son is the Son, S-O-N. Jesus is beautiful because he exists. He's like perfectly proportioned. He seizes your attention and like doesn't lack in anything because he has both he's both a man and God, and he also has the Bible. So Aquinas says that's beauty. Now, there aren't big topics here until we get to, or there aren't big philosophers here until we get to the Germans. So the first German we get is Alexander Baumgarten, who's in the early 18th century. So his big contribution here is just putting aesthetics as a science. So he actually invents the word aesthetics as meaning the study of good and bad taste. Before this, aesthetics just meant your sensory impression of something. So just what it looked like or what it smelled like. He's like, no, there is a science to this. And then what exactly he believes, everyone immediately throws out. So, but he does start off this huge argument over what is the science of what is beautiful. So then we have Immanuel Kant step in, who's a German philosopher who will talk about a lot in both how to think and how to live. Kant is like an incredibly influential philosopher in a lot of ways, and he's actually a great writer. This is him talking about aesthetics, so I don't love it, but he says, aesthetic judgments must be disinterested, universal, and based on an object which appears to have been manufactured for a purpose, but not a definite one. So, disinterested means you shouldn't be concerned with the actual existence of the object. Unlike Aquinas and unlike Aristotle, who say the object has to exist, Kant says you shouldn't be care whether it exists or not. It's universal, which means you say it in which you expect other people to agree with you. Like, if you say that flower is beautiful, you're not saying I think that flower is beautiful. You're saying it as in that flower is beautiful. Don't you guys agree? And then finally, whatever you're talking about needs to appear designed but not have a purpose. So, sunset. Sunset, you don't care whether the sun exists or not. If you say the sun is beautiful, the sunset is beautiful, you expect other people to agree with you because everyone thinks the sunset's beautiful. And it looks designed, like it's not random. It looks very designed, but it doesn't appear to have an actual purpose. And to Kant, that means it's beautiful. Now, you're going to get to the problem with all of these, which you might already get to, which is like, you probably disagree, right? I mean, I disagree. Like, I think, for instance, you might see a particularly, I think it's pretty cool when you see like a very well designed machine, something like that, and it looks beautiful. So I don't know why, for instance, you need anything to be beautiful to not have a specific purpose. But I mean, like, this is how the debates go. So let's keep going. Then we've got Hegel, and Hegel, who is late 18th, early 19th century, famous German philosopher, also famously hard to understand. If you're interested in reading him, he says aesthetics are only based around how fully the ideal is conveyed. So the only reason why something is beautiful is if it conveys some sense of uh, some idea. So, this is The Scream by Edward Munch, and you have to, it conveys like this idea of like panic, whatever. So it was painted after Hegel died, but you would think Hegel would think this is like very beautiful because it's very much conveying uh, this sense. It's so that's what Hegel says. Yeah, and then we've got 20th century, where we come to Adorno and Derrida, where Adorno is a German philosopher where he says art is only beautiful in how it exposes the gaps left by previous artists. So any art which is sort of the same as other people have been painting or making is not beautiful. But if it's something that hasn't been painted before and should have been painted, then it's beautiful. And then sort of the most modern one is Jacques Derrida, who's a French philosopher whose opinion of everything is nothing means anything. Everything is contextual. Art isn't beautiful in and of itself. Music isn't beautiful. A sunset isn't beautiful. It all depends on context and where you're coming from and what your background is, which is sort of like, I think Derrida takes it too far, but it does seem like, what you consider beautiful does depend on your background. That, to me, that seems sort of obvious. And by the way, this is a picture of, I think it's a performance art piece with a guy smashing up art with an axe. Um, so that's sort of my impression of how exactly the study is going right now. Currently, everyone is taking Derrida's view and being like, nothing matters, there's no truth, there's no existence, nothing is beautiful. And that sort of seems to be the current study of aesthetics, which sort of smashes up everything that previous philosophers found beautiful. So, why why haven't I covered this in more depth? Uh, there are a lot of people who write on aesthetics. There are a lot of Germans specifically who write on aesthetics. They disagree with each other a lot. Like, I mean, I know philosophers disagree with each other, but philosophers on aesthetics are constantly disagreeing with each other. They are constantly forming new opinions. There's not really clear why they think the things that they do. If you had to just read one philosopher on aesthetics, you'd read Kant, who is always clear, always intelligent. I don't find his views particularly interesting in this instance. If he thinks nature is the ultimate beauty, like, but what does he say if you like disagree? Like, then, you know. So overall, I've avoided the philosophy of aesthetics, mostly because I just don't see what you're supposed to take away from it. You're not going to become a better artist. You're not going to appreciate art on a deeper level. To use Descartes' terms, the philosophy of aesthetics seems mostly barren. If it doesn't help you appreciate art and it doesn't help you make art, then why are you, what are you talking about then? So, unfortunately, this brief lecture on aesthetics marks the end of the promo classes. So I do have a quote from Bertrand Russell that I'd like to read now. Before I do that, though, are there any questions about aesthetics? If modern paintings are hard to understand, yes. I mean, a lot of the reason why modern paintings are hard to understand is because they go off the views of people like Adorno and Derrida, who say that art isn't supposed to mean things and art is supposed to be exposing gaps. And so they end up with art that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And part of it is because it's like it's this weird conversation that they're having with only themselves, only like a select group of people. I find it pretty frustrating, like personally. But that is the reason why modern paintings are hard to understand. And that's also the reason why it can be incredibly confusing, because it's sort of less a painting in the traditional sense and more a part of a conversation which you need to, which is hard to follow. It's like basically a different language. Any other questions? All right, cool. So let me close this class by quote from Bertrand Russell, which is Bertrand Russell is of course the guy who wrote the book that we're reading. All right. So, and I particularly like this quote. You'll find it in the Word document. So, by the way, before I start on this quote, because it's a bit long, everyone can hear me, see me, understand me? Okay, well, I guess that counts. All right, awesome. So here's a quote from, oh, handsome, thank you very much. Here's a quote from Bertrand Russell, who I don't know if you guys knew this. He actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He has a great speech, too. So Bertrand Russell says, three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, an unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course, over a great ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. I have sought love first because it brings ecstasy, ecstasy so great that I would often have sacrificed all the rest of life for a few hours of this joy. I have sought it next because it relieves loneliness, that terrible loneliness in which one shivering consciousness looks over the rim of the world into the cold, unfathomable, lifeless abyss. I've sought it finally because in the union of love I have seen, in a mystic miniature, the prefiguring vision of the heaven that saints and poets have imagined. This is what I have sought. Though it might seem too good for human life, this is what at last I have found. With equal passion I have sought knowledge. I have wished to understand the hearts of men. I have wished to know why the stars shine, and I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which number holds sway above the flux. A little of this, but not much, I have achieved. Love and knowledge, so far as they were possible, led upward towards the heavens. But always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain reverberate in my heart, children in famine, victims tortured by oppressors, helpless old people, a hated burden to their sons, the whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. I long to alleviate this evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. This has been my life. I have found it worth living. I would gladly live it again if the chance were offered me. So, I'm not going to totally abandon you guys here. Now that we've read the quote, we'll go through it paragraph by paragraph. That'll be the last thing we'll do until, well, the actual classes start in a couple weeks. So this will be the last time I'll see you guys for a while, which is a little sad. So, 3 passions, so 3 strong feelings, simple but strong, have governed my life. Longing for love, wants love, searches for knowledge, and he has pity for the suffering of mankind. Makes sense. He feels bad for mankind's suffering. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither. So, like he's saying, these feelings like winds have blown me here and there in a wayward course, so all around, over a great ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. So it's like he's in a boat, this tiny boat in a huge storm, and it's blowing him all around over his ocean, his anguish, like despair, these strong feelings, and he's almost ready to give up. And this is true. Bertrand Russell's life, not only was he a great philosopher, but he was always involved in politics, and specifically a big one of his was feminism and nuclear nonproliferation. So, he sought love because it brings ecstasy. So ecstasy is like very strong joy. I've sought love first because it brings ecstasy. Ecstasy so great that I would often have sacrificed all the rest of life for a few hours of this joy. So it's such a strong feeling of happiness that he would have sacrificed everything else just to live for a couple hours. Why else has he sought love? Well, because it relieves loneliness. That terrible loneliness in which one shivering consciousness looks over the rim of the world, cold, unfathomable, lifeless abyss. So when he feels so lonely, he feels like he's looking into a deep, dark pit. There's a famous phrase from sort of Christian theology, long dark night of the soul. So when you feel like you're looking out into this dark world. And finally, why else has Bertrand Russell sought love? Because in the union of love I have seen, in a mystic miniature, the prefiguring vision of the heaven that saints and poets have imagined. So he sought love because he's seen in love, he's seen heaven. This is what saints and poets have imagined, is the sort of joy that we get from love. And so this is what I had sought, and though it might seem too good for human life, this is what at last I have found. So he spent his entire life trying to find this love, and even though it might have seemed impossible, finally he's found it. As a great philosopher, of course, he has also sought knowledge. He wished to understand the hearts of men, wished to know why the stars shine, and I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which number holds sway above the flux. So, what does he mean by this? Well, Pythagoras, remember, he's a famous Greek mathematician. You guys, of course, know Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And during Russell's time, And during our own time, one of the great mysteries is why is it that mathematics describes the world so well? Why can physics be described by math? And so, Bertrand Russell tries to understand that. He says, I've understood a little, but not much, which is pretty modest considering he's, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. But he was a modest guy. So love and knowledge, so far as they are possible, led upward toward the heavens. You can imagine this almost as Descartes saying this, right? But always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain reverberate in my heart. Children in famine, victims tortured by oppressors, helpless old people a hated burden to their sons, hungry children, victims of torture, old people whose sons hate them, whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. So this is it, it almost insults what human life should be, that this pain exists. So I long to alleviate this evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. So he wishes he could make it better, but he can't, so instead he suffers. So this has been my life. I have found it worth living and would gladly live it again if the chance were offered me. So why did I pick this quote, besides the fact that it's beautiful and it's by the author of the textbook? Because I think it's sort of a nice sum up of philosophy. We've got love and we've got pity. So that's how to live. We've got knowledge, which is how to think. We've got govern, because that's how we're going to alleviate this evil. Right? All right. Cool stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed the quote. I hope you guys have enjoyed these promo classes. I very much enjoyed them. It's been great working with you guys. We have a couple more discussion questions that I'll upload on Reddit. And then, yeah, I'll see you guys for the real classes in about a month. But yeah, it's been really nice. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have too. Yeah, and of course, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. No problem. You're welcome. Induction and abduction. uh, Abduction is kidnapping someone. It is taking someone away illegally. Induction is a method of reasoning. Um, so I think I'm not sure exactly what you meant there. Oh, different abduction. Oh, you mean abductive reasoning? So I mean, that's a little complicated. Um, we can sort of, uh, yeah, let's hold off on that for now. I would say most basically, it's sort of like a different, it's sort of deduction, but not as certain. Um, yeah, if you're, well, yeah, if you're particularly interested, um, post a question on Reddit and we can discuss it. Sound good? All right. So Descartes, did Descartes find the weakness of Bacon's method? No. So Descartes and Bacon didn't seem to uh, know of each other. Um, so it was more like Descartes and Bacon both saw a problem with what Aristotle was doing. So yeah, Descartes took a different path than Bacon did. Um, Instead of getting mad that Aristotle's method can't, yeah, yeah, exactly. Instead of Descartes thinking, oh, Aristotle's method doesn't make sense in terms of like understanding about the outside world, Descartes says Aristotle's method doesn't make sense because it doesn't give us enough definite knowledge. All right, cool, good question. Yeah, why exactly is it that the Germans study about aesthetics rather than the French or Italian? Uh, so if you want a cynical, somewhat unfair answer, my cynical, unfair answer is because the French and the Italian were actually French and Italians were actually creating art, and the aesthetics and the Germans found it easier to study art. Um, Beyond that, I mean, people have all sorts of things, all sorts of like national theories. Uh, are the philosophers' views on aesthetics the same as with artists? Um, it depends. There have been artists which have their own views. Um, I would say, generally speaking, no. I think a lot of artists don't even think about it that much. Um, However, if you get like the really academic art, like sort of university professors who make music or write books or something like that, or make paintings, then yeah, they'll be sort of involved in the same dialogue. But if you're thinking of famous artists like, I don't know, like Beethoven or Bach or someone like that, then no, they're sort of not even in this conversation, which is one of the reasons I find it really frustrating that like uh, um, they have this conversation about art and they never ask the artists. And so I've got, can you give me an example of how to find a beautiful girlfriend using philosophy? Um, uh, well, so my podcast on Shimalaya has these logical puzzles. So if you uh, tell, if you're in a conversation with a beautiful girl, you can keep her interest and make her interested in the conversation with you with these beautiful puzzles, with these puzzles. And and beyond that, um, like you can memorize like very beautiful quotes from philosophy. Like for example, Bertrand Russell's quote that we covered here. Beautiful. If you can just sort of state that one, pretend that it's your own, pretend you made it up. She'll think you're very smart, you're very clever, and she'll become your girlfriend. So that's it. That's my best advice. Uh, uh, yes. Unfortunately, if anyone was in this philosophy class trying to learn how to best pick up girls, you can let me know how it went. But I will say maybe it wasn't the best class. I've actually thought about teaching a poetry class, And I feel like that would actually be a great class to attend if you want to pick up girls. Because poetry is the quickest way to a woman's heart. Or, on the other hand, of course, to a man's heart as well, if you want to impress a handsome man. Not saying it's only for those seeking girlfriends. Uh, all right. Well, it is 11 o'clock. So, yeah, I guess this is it for about a month. The discussion will continue on Reddit. The You guys don't have to abandon philosophy completely for a month. So yeah, let's talk on Reddit. And beyond that, it's been a lot of fun doing these promo classes, and I'm looking forward to the real class. It'll be even better. All right, bye bye.